Our media environment is vastly different than it once was. Russian influence through social media had far-reaching effects on our past presidential election, and now, more than ever, audiences need to be keenly aware of the information they're being fed, where it's coming from, and the agenda behind it. Good evening, everyone. My name is Mike Hathaway, and the research team next to me, Joe Kiley, Tiffany Walker, and Rochelle Rieger, we're all master's students here at SDSU, and we're also all active duty Navy Public Affairs officers. This year, we endeavored to conduct an experiment using intermedia agenda setting as a theoretical base to determine the credibility that audiences would attribute to information presented in a news article, but presented in 3 different contexts. Now, you might think that presenting information as coming from a state-run news source would raise a number of red flags in the minds of the reader, but you might want to think again.
Now, how did we get there? As Mike mentioned, we manipulated source attribution in 3 different ways from the Xinhua News Agency. The Xinhua News Agency, based in China, is a state-run news agency that was once dubbed the Communist Party's throat and tongue by Mao Zedong, the country's first president. So what we did was we took source attribution as our independent variable, and we used perceived message credibility as our dependent variable. Meshing these things together, we created 3 Reuters articles that we used as experimental cells. The experimental cells featured Xinhua News Agency's messages on reactions in China to U.S. Navy activities in the South China Sea, something of particular importance to the U.S. Navy. So those 3 experimental cells started off with the first one. The first one attributed messages to Xinhua, a state-run news agency run by the Chinese government. In the second experimental cells, messages were attributed to Xinhua News Agency as simply a news agency based in China. And finally, our third cell, the control group, featured messages that had no source attribution in them. Using an online social sciences research tool, we conducted the experiment using a convenient sample of currently enrolled San Diego State University students. Given that the majority of young people consume their news online and the bulk of media messages also are created and propagate online, this sample of young and internet-using adults was particularly apt to measure our dependent variable perceived message credibility.
Now, our post-test experiment looked at source attribution of messages to better understand reader-assigned message credibility. Now, credibility was assessed across a 5-point Likert scale across 4 areas measured that we've heard about. That is China, Xinhua, the article itself, and the reporter. Now, our first research question asked how audiences would perceive credibility of state-run sources and propaganda messages when they were quoted in Western media. Now, we found when asking our participants that almost a third, or 30%, showed a high knowledge of what propaganda is and its purpose based on the 4 correct answers they had on the true-false questions that we asked of them. Now, we measured our credibility scores across the 3 experimental cells in order to judge and answer our research questions. Now, what we found using an ANOVA, or an analysis of variance, we found that there was a statistically significant effect in regard to China credibility that was generalizable to the population at a greater than 98% probability. And looking at that, we found that our results, in terms of the experimental cells, the readers of the state-run news article, where Xinhua was referred to as state-run news, perceived a higher credibility for China than compared to the readers of the news agency article, where Xinhua was just referred to as a news agency. Now, that news agency article readers also perceived lower China credibility score when compared to our control cell and the state-run cells. To restate that, the readers of our state-run news article perceived higher credibility for China than compared to the readers of either the news agency article or the article where attribution was not given to the media outlet. Now, our second research question asked how audiences would perceive credibility of Western media when quoting these same state-run sources or propaganda messages. In this area, we found no statistically significant findings related to readers' credibility of the reporter or the Reuters article itself.
So now we get to the exciting part, right? What does this mean for us as practitioners, and what does it do to better our understanding of intermedia agenda setting theory? As Joe mentioned, when Xinhua was said to be a state-run news agency, readers gave China more credibility. Now, as the research team, we assumed that when readers saw Xinhua as run by the government, well, those messages have to be credible, right? They're from the government. We assumed that they saw Xinhua as an unbiased information subsidy, something that someone like one of the 4 of us would release on behalf of the Department of Defense or the government of the United States, presenting fair, unbiased, again, accurate information. They didn't see it as propaganda coming from the Chinese government. So what is this misunderstanding and our significant results present vital tasks for us as practitioners. We must explain and identify propaganda and what state-run media actually is. If the public does not perceive a lower level of credibility when dealing with a propaganda news source, they run the risk of identifying that information as factual, especially when it's quoted within a Western media outlet that should be presenting unbiased news. This only furthers the propagandist agenda. So as diligent practitioners, we need to present the public with that fair, unbiased information and craft our communication plans to counter this information. We also need to be able to speak to our dominant coalition about what's going on in our media environment. Additionally, there's this potential kind of domino effect of intermedia agenda setting. The heavy hitters, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, research has proven that they set the agenda for smaller local news outlets. So, for example, if the New York Times is quoting Xinhua in one of their stories and a newspaper in, say, Nebraska looks to what the New York Times is covering and then puts it on their cover as well, well, that really expands our target audience. So as practitioners, when we're thinking about a communication plan, identifying target publics or who we need to address this propaganda messaging with, we need to zoom out and widen our scope and understand this domino effect of intermedia agenda setting theory. Fake news, and I'll kind of lump propaganda into that fake news umbrella for now, it's not going away anytime soon. And as diligent practitioners, we need to understand that media environment and be able to counter propaganda when necessary.
In closing, intermedia agenda setting is kind of like a chain of custody of information, and it facilitates the flow of information coming from state-run news sources to the American public. The time is now for we as practitioners to increase our awareness to effectively combat that flow of information. And additionally, we need to continue to measure with increased precision the American public's ability to identify propaganda. This experiment further identified the need for research on intermedia agenda setting as it relates to foreign media's effect on U.S. publics. And I'd like to thank you for your attention this evening. That's our closing, and we'd be happy to entertain any questions at this time.